Plötzlich Bäcker, der Brotpodcast von und mit Lutz Geisler. Hallo und herzlich willkommen zu einer neuen Folge meines Podcasts. Und auf diese Folge bin ich besonders gespannt, denn ich habe einen Gast bei mir, allerdings nicht direkt neben mir sitzen, sondern über den großen Ozean hinüber bei mir sitzen, den ich schon sozusagen in meinen Bäcker-Kinderschuhen begleitet habe, oder besser gesagt, er hat mich begleitet in Form seines Buches Bread. Und das ist immer noch ein ganz besonderes Buch, das bei mir im Regal steht, und ich freue mich deshalb umso mehr, dass Jeffrey Hamelman heute mein Gast sein wird. Ja, ich habe mit Jeffrey eine besondere Beziehung, denn wir kennen beide eine Bäckerin, eine deutsche Bäckerin in Vermont, die Heike, die dort ab und an Brot bäckt und verkauft und gut vernetzt ist in der Brotszene Vermonts. Und Jeffrey hat natürlich auch eine Geschichte zu Vermont zu erzählen, und das werde ich ihn dann auch gleich fragen. Zuerst aber noch ein paar Worte zu Jeffrey. Jeffrey ist auf dem amerikanischen Brotmarkt unter den Profibäckern wie auch unter den Hobbybäckern sehr bekannt, weil er etliche Jahre für die King Arthur Mühle die Bäckerei betrieben hat, Weiterbildung betrieben hat, also viele Profibäcker, die man heute auch kennt, auch die jungen Stars, sind irgendwann mal mit Jeffrey Hamelman in Kontakt gekommen, und fast jeder ambitionierte Hobbybäcker hier in Deutschland hat natürlich auch sein Buch, das mittlerweile in viele Sprachen übersetzt ist und ein Standardwerk in der englischsprachigen Brotliteratur geworden ist. Also Jeffrey Hamelman, ein ganz besonderer Gast, und jetzt sage ich erst einmal Hallo Jeffrey, herzlichen Dank, dass du hier bist. Hallo.
Hallo der Lutz.
Auch wenn wir heute eine etwas schlechtere Tonqualität, der Weg über den Atlantik ist relativ weit, hinnehmen müssen, als wir das üblicherweise gewöhnt sind, freue ich mich, ganz viele Fragen an dich loswerden zu können, Jeffrey.
Well, thank you, and I'm really glad to be talking to you.
Ja, kommen wir vielleicht gleich zur ersten Frage. Als ich vergangenes Jahr in Vermont zu Besuch war bei Heike und anderen Bäckern, haben wir uns ja leider verpasst, um eine Woche ungefähr. Umso mehr freue ich mich ja jetzt, dass wir uns nun hören können. Ich habe in deinem Buch Bread viel gelesen, und das hat ja auch meine Hobbybäckerei begründet, und es steht auch immer noch als eines der wichtigsten Bücher in meinem Regal. In diesem Buch beschreibst du ja auch viele deiner Auslandsaufenthalte. Und ich vermute mal, du könntest sicher in den großen Weltmetropolen Brot backen. Deshalb meine Frage, was hat dich denn in das vergleichsweise beschauliche Vermont verschlagen?
Oh, well, my home is Vermont. I've lived here full-time since 1983, with the exception of 2 years when I was out of the state. And this is where my heart is in Vermont. It's a very beautiful state. It's small. You were there. It's rural. It's hills and mountains and forests and rivers and a lot of farms. I like it, the environment, very much in terms of the social aspects of it, the community aspects of it, the camaraderie of it. And this is where I feel the most serene, is being in Vermont. It doesn't mean I don't like to travel. I have enjoyed traveling over the years, and a lot of the travel I've done is for baking-related purposes. But I know where I want to live, and that's in Vermont. I don't think I would thrive if I lived in a city. That would be a very challenging thing for me. So that's it, yeah.
Ich denke, dass Vermont relativ ähnlich zum Erzgebirge ist, also auch viele kleine Orte, relativ wenige Menschen und eine wunderbare Landschaft. Ja, die nächste Frage, die sich da anschließt, geht im Grunde auch zu meinen Wurzeln zurück. Ich habe ja selbst angefangen, Brot zu backen, um meinen Kopf frei zu bekommen. Also um mal abzuschalten von der alltäglichen Arbeit, vom PC, vom Labor, in dem ich damals gesessen habe. Wie und warum bist du Bäcker geworden?
Oh, no, I wasn't one of those children who, by the age of 8, knew what he wanted to do. I lived, I guess, more spontaneously. I didn't really have plans, and I'm 69 years old. And so when I was a teenager, America was in a very, very difficult place. There were the many cities were on fire, literally from riots. Vietnam was raging. The country was at least as divided as it is today. And I went off to college. I went to a very good college, but it didn't seem relevant. So I quit after 2 years and 3 days. And then shortly thereafter, I went to Europe for the first time and was there for, I think I was there for 10 weeks. I had $200 with me, so I was living kind of like a cat. And, I would run out of money and then give blood. And I hitchhiked it I went through Köln and Thiers. Where is it that Karl Marx was born? Whatever town that was. I went through there and hitchhiked through Germany and just went all over the place, down to Greece and all this. And when I came home, I started working for Polish farmers in Massachusetts, in a very agricultural part of America. The land had been farmed for over 300 years, which for America, with our comparatively short history, at least the Caucasian history, 300 years is immensely long. And I was very, very deeply loving farming work. And for a few years, I worked with these old Polish farmers. And then I rented land with my girlfriend in that same area, and we started to farm. And I loved the work, but we couldn't make any money. We were trying to be organic, or bio, as you call it, in the mid-70s, and it was quite challenging. So that didn't last too well. And so then I left and lived in an artist community for a year. I was hired to be the maintenance guy, so I got a paycheck of $20 a week, which is, I guess, about 15 euros a week plus room and board. But it seemed great because at least I had a steady paycheck. Well, prior to going to the artist community, in the next town from where I was farming, a German woman had started a bakery. And I met her one day and had a long talk with her. It was a small bakery, and it was fascinating to talk to her. And this was the time when, like a lot of hippies, I was making homemade bread, and it was, something that the goats might like, but I don't think it was particularly good in terms of flavor for humans. But anyway, it was that era. And so meeting this woman who was making true rye breads and all kinds of really wonderful products, that was a real eye-opener for me. But then I went off to live in this artist community, and I spent a year there, and then I knew I wanted to the valley, and I said to this woman, Susan Nagala, I said, bake for you? Would you hire me? Well, she had a pastry chef who was from Paris, and she had a bread baker who was from Grenoble, so it was a lot of very French-influenced baked goods, plus there were all the classic German things that she was contributing to the bakery. And I said, would you hire me? And she very emphatically said, no, you can't bake. You're an American. And and she meant it. So that was okay. And then I went back a couple weeks later, and I said, Susan, would you hire me? And she said, no, you can't bake. You're an American. And this went on for quite some time. At one point, what happened was I knew where she lived, and one morning I brought her a loaf of bread that I had made at home, and I knocked on her door. It was about 8 o'clock in the morning, and she answered the door in her bathrobe. And I said to her, Susan, would you hire me? And the only time she didn't say, you can't bake, you're an American, was then, because instead she simply slammed the door in my face. So I wasn't getting much progress. But then one day I asked her again if she'd hire me, and then I knew I had won, because the light kind of went out of her eyes and her shoulders kind of slumped. And she said, okay, but you'll have to make the pretzels. And I said, okay, I'll do anything. So she hired me to make the pretzels. That was $400 a day. And then within a week, it was like, okay, do you remember that challah bread from your grandmother's recipe that you told me about? We will start making challah on Friday. And then I was quite lucky because the French didn't want anything to do with those German products. And she was getting busy enough where she had to manage her bakery and not bake anymore. So she said to me, okay, you will make the Schwarzwälder Kirschtorte, and then you will make the you name it, Dreistufen Sauerteigführung. You think my German is terrible. I apologize. And the
I
Linzer
understand.
Torte, and all these different German products. So here I was with Frenchmen, and I'm doing all this German stuff, and I couldn't have been luckier. So that was how I started baking. I started at 6 a.m. Wednesday morning, September 1st, 1976. And prior to baking, I had had 25 jobs because I used to keep silly little lists of every place I lived and every place I traveled and every job I had. Well, I had 25 jobs before I started baking. So I started at 6 a.m. and I said to myself at about 6:02 a.m., I said, this is the work I want to do. This is the work I want to do. And what attracted me to baking initially wasn't just these miraculous products. That was certainly part of it. But I was very, very attracted by the manual nature of the work, because it seems quite natural for humans to want to move their bodies and use their bodies. And I was very attracted by the obscurity of it, that, bakers were providing all this nourishment and pleasure, but they were basically anonymous. You're working at hours when most people aren't even awake, and I was literally baking in the basement where the production was, and I was very, very attracted to the kind of anonymous nature of the work. So it was a perfect fit for me right from the beginning.
Also, wenn ich das jetzt richtig verstanden habe, dann hast du zuerst deutsche Backwaren gebacken. Also zum Beispiel Brezeln.
Yeah, that's right. So it was every day was pretzels, and then I would do a specialty bread. I was on the day shift. I was actually starting work at 6 a.m. The night
Mhm.
baker, the man from Grenoble, he was baking through the night. So he would make the majority of the breads. I've spent more time on pastries in my baking life than breads. And in that bakery, in Susan's bakery, I would make one bread every day, all the pretzels, and then I would make a variety of pastries.
Wo hast du außerhalb dieser ersten Station denn dein Bäckerhandwerk gelernt?
Oh, well, let's see. I spent 5 years working for Susan. And then I left and I lived in Ireland for a while and worked at a not good bakery in Ireland. But I felt like you learn everywhere you go. Even if you're in a bad place, you learn what not to do. But after 5 years with Susan, I had, you know, learned so much because after all, the French, they had gone through the apprenticeship system. So their efficiency was great. Their product knowledge was great. Susan had all these great German things that she taught me. So it was a very, very good start. And then after I came back from Ireland, I lived for a couple of years on an island off the coast of Massachusetts called Martha's Vineyard. And I worked at a very bad bakery there. Um, and then I told myself that I wanted to move to Vermont for good because I had always loved Vermont when I had visited. And I said, I'd like to start a bakery before I turned 33. And I wound up starting a bakery in southern Vermont when I was 32. Work was so compelling to me that it was very natural to want to explore and grow and, learn about new products, make new products. So I would never say that I'm self taught because that's just a very egocentric thing to say. I'm not self taught, but I was so eager to learn that I kept my eyes open and just kept learning from. Oh, books were certainly very, very helpful to learn from, and different people, different. This was long before the internet, so there wasn't any of this.
Mhm.
The Instagram type postings or YouTube things. So, but I just loved it so much that it seemed so fascinating that it was natural to want to learn.
Hast du auch in Deutschland Brotbackerfahrungen gesammelt oder hat es dich gleich woanders hin verschlagen?
I had been with Susan just about 3 or 4 months, and she knew that I was very avid. And her husband was a pretty well-renowned violist in a string quartet. He was also German. And Susan told me that he had relatives in Heilbronn, north of Stuttgart, and that the best bread she had ever eaten was coming from a bakery there. And if she could arrange it, would I like to go and work in Germany in the summer? And I said, of course. And so I had been baking just a mere 10 months, I think, when I went to Heilbronn and worked for 1 month in a bakery there. It was a pretty big place. It had 8 steam-injected wood-fired ovens. It had a big tunnel oven, where you put the products in at one end and a chain takes them through this long tunnel and it comes out on the other end finished. And that was just the bread area. Then there was also a massive Kaiser roll operation that was all automated. And then there was the whole pastry department. I didn't work at all in the pastry department. I just worked in the bread area. And I worked there for a month. And that was also an excellent experience for me. So that was the first time I worked overseas. I had been in Germany earlier after I had quit college and I had traveled to Europe for the first time. But the first working experience I had in Europe was in this bakery in Germany. So the good thing was it gave me an indication from a young age. I was 25 when I started working, so I was 26 when I was at Heilbronn. And it gave me a very good indication of how broad the world of baking is and how fascinating the world of baking is. If there was one negative part of the experience, it's that I had only been baking for 10 months at that point, and so I had so little true understanding of baking. If I had been baking, say, 2 or 3 years, then I would have gotten a lot more out of it because I would have been much more knowledgeable about baking. But nevertheless, I never regretted having done that. It was a great experience.
Wie ging es denn nach Susan weiter? Hat es dich dann in andere Länder verschlagen oder bist du gleich wieder zurück nach Vermont in die USA?
Oh, well, let's see. So after I left Susan, then I went to Ireland, worked there. Then I worked on that bad bakery on Martha's Vineyard. And then I started my own bakery. Well, I was in southern Vermont at my own bakery for 14 years. So I started a bakery on December 5th, 1983. That was the anniversary of Mozart's death. And I had that bakery for 14 years. It was a wonderful place, and I learned and learned and learned and began making chocolates, which I love to do, and just expanded a lot in the realm of pastry and different breads. And I kind of always assumed that I would just, be the baker for that town. It was only 12,000 people, but it was a thriving town. And I just thought that would be my entire life. Well, it turned out that the woman I was married to, we had one of those divorces that just is completely irrational. It was too lengthy, it was too painful, it was too expensive and all that. And when it was finally over...
I know it.
Too many of us know it. When it was over, her lawyer was slicker than my lawyer, and she wound up getting the bakery. So I had to leave my own bakery, which was a little tough. But I had been asked by the Culinary Institute of America, which is one of the better culinary schools in the U.S. They had asked me if I would be an instructor there, and I had said, this was while I still owned the bakery. I said, no, I'm going to be baking in Brattleboro until I'm dead, so I can't be an instructor there. But anyway, after I lost my bakery, I went and taught there for 2 years and learned a lot about teaching, because that's what I was doing. And I was very devoted to the students. But then I had the opportunity to return to Vermont and start a bakery and a baking school for the King Arthur Flour Company. King Arthur's the oldest flour company in America. It was started in 1790. So for America, that's quite old. And so I went back to Vermont. I was overjoyed to return to Vermont and started the bakery and the education center. And so I was the director of the bakery, and I taught all the professional classes. So I was there for 18 years, and then I left there just over 3 years ago. I gave a 1-year notice that I was going to leave, and then after 18 years, I left King Arthur. I wanted to leave my job while I still loved it, because so many people, they stay in their job until they're bitter, and I didn't want to be like that. So I said, you know what, I still love it, and I want to love it when I leave, so I'm going to give a 1-year notice, and I'm glad I made that decision. So for the last 3 years, I've taught in a lot of different places, but I haven't worked full-time in a production bakery.
Kommen wir mal zu einer ganz anderen Frage. Das geht jetzt eher Richtung Brotpolitik, Brotkultur. Mein derzeitiger Eindruck für Deutschland jedenfalls ist, dass es sehr viele durchschnittliche Brote in den Handwerksbäckereien gibt, aber nur ganz, ganz selten herausragende Qualität, insbesondere geschmacklich. Das Brot sieht meistens toll aus, aber es schmeckt nicht und besitzt keinen eigenen Charakter. In den USA oder auch in Japan war das auf meinen Reisen der letzten Jahre ganz anders. Entweder gab es richtig schlechte Backwaren in den Supermärkten oder es gab ausnahmslos sehr, sehr gute Brote in kleinen Handwerksbäckereien. Wenn ich es also zuspitzen müsste, würde ich sagen, in Deutschland ruht man sich größtenteils auf der historischen Brotkultur aus, und in den USA oder Japan und natürlich auch in vielen anderen Ländern wird die Brotkultur noch von Handwerksbäckern gelebt. Ist das so? Siehst du das genauso, oder ist in den USA das Bild ganz anders, das sich mir dann vielleicht falsch gezeichnet hat?
Well, that's a good question, Lutz. It's also a complicated question. America is a huge country, and there would likely be large parts of the country that do not have good bread at all. There are regions such as Vermont, which has quite a number of very high quality small bakeries, and other parts of the country you'll see the same thing, and it's certainly better now than it's been since I started baking. But you can easily find terrible bread in America. Terrible, terrible bread. And most bread is terrible. It's not even mediocre. It's terrible. But as far as the good bakeries go, I think what America does, there's a certain characteristic of America that represents a lot of what's really bad, and at the exact same time represents a lot of what's very good. And what I mean by that is the following. America doesn't have a 1,000-year-old food culture. It's a new country, comparatively speaking, and the food culture is very new. And so a lot of the food is not good because America became industrialized fairly early on. A lot of the food is processed food. That certainly is the case with bread. And so America really does a lot of bad food. At the same time, because America doesn't have a long food history, it means that people who do want to make good food, they very freely look at other countries to see what they're doing well, and then they personalize it and give it a sort of an American spin on it. So, for example, Americans who are eager and want to learn and grow, they very readily will say, oh my gosh, look at these incredible things coming from Germany. I want to learn how to make those. And if they're conscientious, they can learn how to make them quite well. And then they'll say, oh my gosh, look at this product from Spain. I want to learn how to make that. And they'll do that. Oh my gosh, look what the French are doing. Look what the Italians are doing. Look what the Russians are doing. And so we pick and choose from different cultures, and that I find to be a very positive thing because it keeps our enthusiasm high and it gives us the opportunity to grow in many, many different directions. And this is fairly unique because maybe it's changing now, but I think it was very rare for French bakers to say, "Oh my gosh, look at all those beautiful German rye breads. Let's go make those." Or for Germans, until perhaps quite recently, German bakers weren't saying, "Oh my gosh, I had an incredible baguette in Paris. I think I want to start selling baguettes." So most European countries stay within their own borders because they do have a very old food culture. Whereas America, just do what you want. And so it goes both way in America. Does that answer your question?
Ja, das ist interessant. Der Unterschied ist also einfach der Blick über den Tellerrand, vermutlich. Da schließt sich vielleicht gleich die nächste Frage an. Ein großer Unterschied zwischen Deutschland und den USA ist ja der Meisterzwang, den du sicherlich auch schon kennengelernt hast auf deinen Reisen. Bei uns darf ja nur selbstgebackenes Brot verkauft werden von derjenigen Person, die zuvor auch eine Meisterausbildung absolviert hat. Das heißt, ich selbst als Hobbybäcker dürfte gar kein Brot verkaufen in Deutschland, wenn ich nicht den Meister absolviert habe oder einen kleinen Querweg finde, der sich teilweise in Grauzonen darstellt. In den USA, das ist der große Unterschied, darf jeder Brot verkaufen, der sich an die allgemeinen Hygieneregeln hält. Siehst du das jetzt als Vorteil für eine lebendige Brotkultur oder wünschst du dir sogar manchmal ein System nach Art des deutschen Meisterzwangs in die USA hinein?
I can put out a sign at the end of my driveway that says, "Auto repairs here. Bring your car and I'll fix it." Well, I probably couldn't even find the spark plugs, but nothing prevents me from putting out a sign saying, "I'll fix your car for you." Same thing. You want to say you're a baker? You don't have to prove anything. You don't have to go for any training whatsoever. You just start a bakery and nobody's going to stop you. Yeah, you'll be inspected and all that, but you don't need any schooling. You don't need an apprenticeship. You don't need to prove to the state that you have learned not just academically, but also the methodology of baking. In America, there's no regulations whatsoever like that. This is one of the things about, I think the French also, you have to have a CAP, a certificate of aptitude, basically, before you can start a bakery. I'm pretty certain that's a requirement there.
Ja.
And that's so much better in so many ways. And that too can have a couple of different directions of consequence. So, for example, America doesn't have an apprenticeship system for most any profession at all. This can be viewed as being very, very negative because you don't get proper training. You just open up your shop. Well, in Europe, I don't know if it's still a requirement, but certainly for an awful long time, when you're 14 years old, you start your apprenticeship. And you do that for a while, and so that means the quality of your education can be extremely high. What else does it mean? Well, it means that you're being kind of pointed in one direction as a very young child, a 14-year-old, and maybe you also give up certain freedoms or certain abilities to look broadly and with peripheral vision to see what else is there in the world. So that goes both ways. When I worked for Susan, the Parisian pastry chef was a very bitter man. He was very skilled, but very unhappy. He was 35 years old, and he had been baking for 21 of his 35 years. So, in a sense, there are great, great benefits to the apprenticeship system, but from another perspective, you give up your youth. You don't experience 15, 20, 30 different jobs and then decide what you want to do. You pretty much, when you're way too young to really know what you want to do with your life, you're put into a certain track. And I guess you stay there. So, like many things, there's different perspectives on it.
Ehrlich gesagt wünsche ich mir manchmal das System der USA, was jetzt die Bäckereilandschaft angeht, für Deutschland. Denn ich habe den Eindruck, dass das Meistersystem, der Meisterzwang, die wahre Brotkultur, die guten Brote einfach behindert oder sogar verhindert für die deutschen Gaumen. Und ich glaube, ich erzähle da gar nichts so Falsches, wenn ich sage, dass einige Hobbybäcker tatsächlich mehr Wissen und mehr Verständnis für ein gutes Brot haben als manch ein Handwerksbäcker, der das tatsächlich gelernt hat oder gelernt haben soll in der Schule. Es gibt natürlich auch das Gegenteil, aber die Hobbybäcker-Szene, die ist schon recht intensiv dabei und die Themen aufzuarbeiten, die manch Handwerksbäcker und auch manche Berufsschule und auch natürlich die Handwerkskammer links liegen lassen. Wie ist das in den USA?
I think in America too, it's home bakers who very, very often are much more enthusiastic than professional bakers. You know, if you want to look at it from the fairly narrow perspective of industrial bakers versus quote unquote craft bakers, the craft bakers, they might be always looking to learn and grow and learn and grow. And that would be the same as the real passionate home bakers. So just like in Germany, a lot of the best baking comes not so much from the industrial bakers, but from the home bakers. And look, I mean, I don't imagine your books are part of the curriculum for the German system of training bakers, but your book that you sent me is so magnificent, and as I've been told, it's very, very, very successful. So you have an audience of people who are in that category of they love what they're doing, they want to learn more, they want to grow, they want to explore. So in that sense, America is very, very parallel to what's going on in Germany.
Jetzt haben wir gerade erzählt, dass es in den USA kein Meistersystem gibt, kein Meisterzwang gibt. Und jetzt habe ich gelesen, dass du den Titel als einer der wenigen Bäcker aus den USA Certified Master Baker hast. Wie ist es dazu gekommen und was hat es mit diesem Titel auf sich?
Well, there's a trade organization called Retail Bakers of America. And when I was working as a culinary instructor at the Culinary Institute of America, the administration said that anybody that wants to try out for Certified Master Baker, the school would pay the fees to do that. And normally I would not have any interest in that particularly, but I thought, well, yeah, why don't I try out for that and see how I do, because it'll be interesting to see how qualified I am in relation to my peers. And so I tried out for Certified Master Baker, and what it entails is there's 8 different products that range from, you know, braided breads to other breads to decorated cakes to writing on cakes and making marzipan roses and all this sort of thing, and then some mystery product that you don't even know what it's going to be. So it kind of covers a lot of genres of baking. So it's not specifically bread, it's not specifically pastry. It covers pretty much all of that stuff. So I tried out for that, and I did well enough, so I got the certification.
Du hast mir erzählt, dass du jetzt seit mehr als 30 Jahren im Bäckerhandwerk unterwegs bist, tätig bist. Jetzt stellt sich mir die Frage, ob du eine Entwicklung im amerikanischen Bäckerhandwerk gesehen hast, hin zum Guten, hin zum Schlechten. Und vielleicht ist es auch ganz interessant, einmal zu beleuchten, wie du deine eigene Rolle auf dieser Bahn, auf diesem Weg, auf dieser Entwicklung einschätzt.
Oh my gosh, it's changed so much, and mostly for the better. Mostly for the better. It's better now than it's been during my lifetime, for certain. yes, there's still a lot of bad stuff, but if you just look at the good stuff, there's more good stuff now than there's ever been. Um, what's my role? I don't know what my role is. I mean, I love bakers who are not the ones who are, they started out as bakers and then they said, well, this is more work than I thought, but I'll just, spend my time in the office and just hire people to do all the work. They're not really bakers anymore. My heart lives with the people who are at the bench doing the work with a good attitude and with good skill. And they're there for years and sometimes decades. And they're the real foundation. If you look at a tall skyscraper, Lutz, why is it being held up? Well, it's being held up by what you don't see. It's being held up by a really sturdy foundation. And in the same sense, maybe I'm getting a little bit too inaccurate or poetic here or something, but it always seemed to me that bakers are the foundation. In a sense, they were the foundation of society when people got such a great percentage of their calories from bread products. Well, now we don't get so many calories from bread products, but I still like to think of bakers as this foundational and very fundamental and very essential part of society.
Hat es im Laufe der Jahre deiner Bäckertätigkeit eine Person gegeben, also einen Bäcker oder vielleicht auch nur eine Backphilosophie, die dich nachhaltig beeinflusst hat, nach der du auch heute noch lebst oder dein Handwerk verstehst?
What impresses me is individual bakers who I've met who just really have the great spirit. And so, for instance, I was at a wonderful baking event in Spain a couple of times, and the second time I was there was last October, and one of the people who was part of it was a young woman who had just begun baking, but her attitude and her desire to learn and her willingness to work hard was just so remarkable. So it's not one national baking philosophy or style of bread that gives me a philosophy. I guess my philosophy is formed by my interactions with bakers, most of whom, they're just always going to bake and they're never going to have a big fancy name associated with them, but they're just dedicated and they work with great integrity, and that's what makes me feel very strong and positive about the world of baking, is that there are so many wonderful committed people who just do the work with great attitude and good skill because they love the work and they know the importance of the work.
Ja, das kann ich gut nachvollziehen und solchen Personen bin ich auch schon begegnet und die haben natürlich auch immer noch Einfluss auf meine Art, Brot zu backen. Ich frage vielleicht nochmal andersherum und ein bisschen zugespitzter. Bist du ein Sauerteigbäcker oder ein Hefebäcker?
I'll answer that in a second because another thing occurred to me about my baking philosophy. I guess if I had a philosophy, it's that the world of good baking is always in evolution, is always improving. At least that's my hope and my wish. And so I wrote one book about bread making, and one of my motivations, a very big motivation, was the following. There were not really any good bread making books that had been written in English. And I had, at the time when I started the writing, I had been baking for 25 years and I had been teaching for several years. And I felt like, well, I didn't seek to write a book. Somebody just kind of urged me and nagged at me and just for repeatedly said I should do it. And finally, I just wanted to shut her up. So I I had met the editor from John Wiley and Sons, the culinary editor, and she encouraged me to write a sample chapter, and that led to me writing the book. But one of my primary motivations for writing was I felt like, all right, there's nothing that's written in English that's any good. So if I write a good book, that's going to set a new standard. And once that standard is set, that'll give somebody the opportunity to come along and write a book that's better than me, better than mine. And then once that book is written, then that'll give the opportunity for somebody to come along and write a book that's better than that one. And so I just looked at it as this continual evolution so that the world of baking would get better and better. Yeah, and I mean, I don't want to sound like I'm terribly egocentric, but I don't think that there's a book written on bread making in America yet that is better than mine. So I haven't really seen the fulfillment of that bakery philosophy. But there's hope that something will come along. So there's that. And then in terms of am I a sourdough baker or a yeast baker, one of the characteristics of a lot of American bakers, kind of the new generation of bakers, is that it seems like they can't just call themselves a baker. They have to call themselves an artisan baker or a craft baker or something that's really kind of elevates them somehow. And I've always just looked at the word baker to be very noble, and I don't want any adjective. Please just call me a baker. I don't, And then there's also a big contingent of bakers who feel like yeast is an enemy, and anything like white flour is an enemy, and everything has to be sourdough and whole grain. And I don't like to make things narrow. I like to make things broad. And I think for me, I love 100% rye bread. And less so.
That's my favorite.
Yeah, less so. I love, but not as much as 100% rye, but I love 100% whole wheat bread. And I don't feel any sense of shame to say that I love 100% white bread. I mean, to eat a really beautifully made baguette is such a wonderful experience. Do I want that 7 days a week? No, but I don't want 100% rye bread 7 days a week or 100% whole wheat. I want to broaden, not narrow, the breads that are in my life, as long as they're made with respect. It's interesting that, we all know that lovely French word boulanger. Well, the bakers in France weren't called boulanger until the 13th century. Prior to that, they were called palmeliers. And the root for that word is to sift their flour. And they sifted it in 3 gradations, apparently. This information comes from a dear friend of mine, Hubert Chiron, from Nantes. And so the bakers sifted in 3 gradations, and depending upon the desires of their clients and the wealth of their clients, the wealthier clients got the most sifted flour. So the bakers were the sifters. Well, now we have such an incredible variety of food that we can eat that's going to give us good nutrition. So if we eat white bread, there's still a million other foods that we can put into our bodies that's going to provide full nutrition. If you think about, in so many centuries, bread was much more crucial, and yet people really often didn't want whole grain bread. They wanted some sifted flour, even though they get better nutrition from the whole grain. So I just find that interesting, and I'll never feel yeasted breads. In fact, I would prefer a yeasted baguette to a naturally leavened sourdough baguette any day of the week.
Wir unterhalten uns ja nun gerade mitten in der größten Pandemie seit Jahrzehnten. Das Coronavirus hat aber ja nicht nur negative Auswirkungen gehabt oder hat es noch, sondern es hat ganz viele Menschen, in Deutschland jedenfalls, dazu gebracht, über ihre Grundbedürfnisse neu nachzudenken. Ein Grundbedürfnis in Deutschland scheint Brot zu sein. Durch die Ausgangsbeschränkungen haben ganz viele Menschen angefangen, ihr Brot selbst zu backen. Mehl war ausverkauft, Hefe war ausverkauft. Ist das in den USA auch zu beobachten gewesen oder sogar noch zu beobachten?
It's a little strange, but when the virus came to America, the first thing that vanished, this is really strange, was toilet paper.
Yeah, in Germany too.
Really? Huh. But then within a month or so, you could actually buy, I think just online, you could buy toilet paper and every sheet had a picture of Donald Trump on it. This is true. I bought a roll of it, so I can tell you that it's true. But in any event, the second thing that vanished was flour, along with yeast. Just gone. And even big flour companies, like King Arthur, for example, they had to cut off some of their wholesale customers. It wasn't that there wasn't enough flour in the country. It's just that the whole process of getting the flour to the customer, there were too many bottlenecks in it. But yeah, people started baking. And I can tell you that at the King Arthur bakery, at the King Arthur store, I should say, they were selling over 125-kilo bags of flour per week to people. That's a lot of flour for a home baker.
Ja.
The situation is better now, so there's plenty of flour.
Ja, spannend. Dann scheint das Verhältnis der Amerikaner zum Klopapier und zum Mehl gar nicht so verschieden zu sein zu den Verhaltensweisen der Deutschen. Kommen wir mal noch zu einer anderen Frage. Du hast ja nun seit Jahrzehnten Hobbybäcker und Profibäcker ausgebildet. Hast du da über die Jahre so eine Art generellen Tipp, allgemeinen Tipp entwickelt, den du jedem angehenden Hobby- oder Profibäcker mit auf den Weg geben würdest?
Well, certainly if people are keeping a sourdough, then that would be a main piece of advice would be feed your sourdough. I just completed an experiment, and you're a very scientific man, and so you maybe have tried this too. So the sourdough that I have, when I was leaving my first baking job working for Susan Nagel in 1980, she said to me, "Would you like me to show you how to make a German-style rye sourdough?" And I said, sure. I thought there might be some sourdough in my future. So I started making a sourdough on August 28th, 1980. So it's just about 40 years old. And that's the sourdough that I used for, all the years I owned a bakery. And that's the sourdough that was the backbone for the King Arthur bakery, and et cetera, et cetera. And I still have that sourdough. And I feed it 7 days a week, and I don't refrigerate it at all unless I'm traveling. And I keep some dried sourdough as a backup, and every year I refresh it and reactivate it and then dry it again. And I have always said in class, you should feed your sourdough ideally daily, because a lot of people, they want to have a sourdough, but they don't bake that often, so they leave it in the refrigerator for weeks at a time, and then they take it out and make their bread. But I've always said, look, how would you feel if you only ate once a week? Not too good. So it's the same with the sourdough. Plus, the extended cold is going to change the pH. It's going to change the properties, the microorganisms in the sourdough. Well, I would teach that, but I actually never looked into it or anything. So I decided, 2 months ago, I said, you know what? Actually, it was probably 3 months ago. I said, I'm going to, the sourdough that I feed once a day, my rye sourdough, and leave out all the time. I'm also going to, every Sunday, I'm going to feed the culture, the same feeding, but then I'm going to let it ripen until the next morning, and then I'm going to refrigerate it for the rest of the week. And then a week later, I'll take it out, I'll feed it, leave it out overnight, refrigerate it for the rest of the week. And I did that 6 weeks in a row. And then I made an identical 2 batches of bread, one with my sourdough that was fed daily, one with the sourdough that was fed weekly and then refrigerated. And I was insofar as I'm able, I was very scientific in my approach. And it was a bread naturally leavened, just sourdough, with 67% rye flour, 33% white flour. And I have a mill, so the rye flour was milled the day that I made the sourdough. Um, and I just compared it the whole way through, and it was indisputable that the volume was significantly better with the sourdough that was fed daily, and the flavor was better too. And if I had done this refrigerating phase for 6 months instead of 6 weeks, I'm sure that I would have seen an even greater um, difference between the two styles. So, have you done that kind of experiment too?
Ja, ich habe ganz viele Experimente dieser Art durchgeführt für mein Brotbackbuch Nummer 4, also das Sauerteigbuch, das du ja auch hast und das die Heike zum Glück ein bisschen übersetzen kann. Das deckt sich schon mit meinen Erfahrungen, nur leider ist es dem normalen Hobbybäcker natürlich nicht möglich, jeden Tag aufzufrischen, auch wenn das für den Sauerteig besser wäre. Also die gängige Praxis ist eigentlich, dass man den Sauerteig bzw. das Anstellgut, den Starter, einmal die Woche oder einmal alle 1,5, 2 Wochen auffrischt, und wenn man ihn dann wirklich benutzen möchte, vor allem beim Weizensauerteigbrot, dann weckt man ihn richtig auf und frischt ihn dann auch wirklich häufig nacheinander auf, so wie das auch beschrieben wird bei dir im Buch und auch eben in deiner Erklärung. Ja, wenn wir gerade beim Thema Buch sind, dann würde mich auf jeden Fall interessieren, weil das habe ich leider nicht mehr im Kopf, habe ich mir nicht gemerkt, wann dein Buch erschienen ist. Wann gab es die erste Ausgabe von deinem Buch Bread?
Well, it initially was published in 2004, and then there was a second edition that came out in 2013. And about a year and a half ago, very, very unexpectedly, I was contacted by the publisher. Would I be willing to write a third edition? And at first I was reluctant to, because I was afraid that if I wrote a third edition and there wasn't enough new material, that somebody would buy it and say, well, that was a waste of money because, I have the second edition and there's not enough new material. But I thought about it. All right, how much have I grown? How much have I learned as a baker since the second edition? And then eventually I said I would do it. And so the manuscript was due for submission on August 20th, so in like 2 weeks, but I submitted it in May. So now it's in the publication process for the third edition. And so there's like 36 new breads and lots of new variations and new material in general. So that's what I've been doing lately.
Oh, und das ist eine wichtige Information. Ich muss mir das Buch dann unbedingt kaufen, einfach weil es neue Dinge enthält und natürlich auch, um meine kleine Bibliothek aus Brotbackbüchern zu vervollständigen. Ja, ich habe ja an meinem eigenen ersten Buch gemerkt, dass es so ziemlich viel in Bewegung gebracht hat in meinem Leben, und deshalb an dich die Frage, ging es dir mit deinem ersten Buch auch so? Was hat es verändert? Hat es überhaupt irgendwas verändert in deinem Leben?
Yes, it entirely did. And it changed my life completely. And a big reason for that was when I wrote the first edition, and it was just beginning to get into the copy editing and page proofs and all that kind of pre-publication phase. And I said to the editor, I think the book should be anonymous. There shouldn't be a name on it. And the editor thought I was crazy. And I said, but wait a minute, come on, think about it. It's about a topic. It's not about a person. And the only time that they vetoed me was that. They said, no, we're not going to allow that. And in retrospect, I'm really, really so glad and grateful that they did veto me, because as a result, I've I've been on my sourdough and I have been on 6 continents, and I've done a lot of teaching, and I've met some extraordinarily wonderful people. Um, and I think it's really because of the book. It's in, I think, 8 languages too. So often when it's put out in a new language, I get contacted, would I be willing to come and teach? And that's been one reason why I've taught in a lot of different countries over the years.
Eine kleine Frage unter Buchautoren. Weißt du, wie viele Exemplare deines Buches über den Ladentisch gegangen sind über die Jahre?
I don't know. I'd have to look it up. My wife keeps a spreadsheet twice a year. The royalties come in, and when the royalty statement comes along, it tells you the number of foreign sales and the number of domestic sales, and I can't keep that number in my head, so I don't know the answer to that. But I kind of assumed that if it was a good book, then it would sell initially and then it would gradually taper off. That would seem like a natural progression, that sales would start to decrease. But they it seems like they just I think the biggest segment that I had in terms of sales was just a year ago, so it didn't taper off yet. I think one reason is because a lot of culinary schools have it as a required text, and so that means there's always new students who get it. I guess that's one of the reasons. And maybe also because there's more of an interest among home bakers to bake, and so that probably helps too with the sales.
An deinem Buch finde ich einfach faszinierend, dass es die Welt zwischen Hobby- und Profibäckerei gar nicht zu geben scheint, sondern es verschmelzen einfach beide Welten zusammen. Und ja, das hat mich damals beeindruckt. Ich hatte damals, als ich angefangen habe, Brot zu backen, mir auch gleich einen dicken Wälzer, auch aus den USA, gekauft. Advanced Bread and Pastry hieß das, glaube ich. Das ist natürlich ein reines Fachbuch. Da fehlen die Anekdoten, die dein Buch so locker machen. Ich denke, dass dein Buch Bread auch so viel Erfolg hat, weil es eben gerade beide Welten anspricht, also dem Hobbybäcker den Einstieg erleichtert, aber trotzdem die Welt in die Profibäckerei eröffnet, den Blick hineinwagt und dem Profibäcker natürlich auch noch neue Anregungen gibt und seien es einfach Reiseanregungen in die jeweiligen Länder mit den entsprechenden Bäckereien, die du da beschreibst.
Well, that's nice to hear. And one thing too is that there are books like Advanced Bread and Pastry that are full of all kinds of good information, but when books are written with a completely academic angle, like after this chapter you will have learned how to do the following kind of thing, they can be a little bit dry. And to me, the world of baking is so richly warm in kind of the human sense of things, and so one of the things that Wiley was really, the publisher for my book, was really open to was, me just putting in anecdotes that would touch on different aspects of people I've met and experiences that I've had in my baking life. And to me, that makes books more interesting.
In deinem Buch beschreibst du ja ganz viele verschiedene Arten von Brot, von Weizen über Dinkel auch hin zum Roggen. Die USA ist ja nun eigentlich ein Weizenland. Weizen natürlich nicht nur in Hefebackwaren zu verstehen, sondern auch für berühmte Sauerteigbrote wie das San Francisco Sourdough Bread. Du hast, wie gesagt, in deinem Buch auch Roggenbrote aufgenommen, was für die Zeit um 2000 herum wahrscheinlich schon relativ mutig war in den USA. Welche Bedeutung hat denn Roggen für dich und hat sich das Interesse an Roggen in den letzten Jahren in den USA verändert, hin zum Positiven, also wenn wir jetzt den Roggen mal als positiv betrachten würden, oder hat das Interesse weder ab noch zugenommen oder ist vielleicht sogar geringer geworden?
There's definitely an increase in interest. You have to understand that most rye bread in America, up until, I don't know how many years ago, but not that many years ago, 2 or 3 decades maybe, rye bread was terrible. It would be industrial. It would be almost always with caraway seeds. It would be just with like a type 600 rye flour and then 90% white flour. So it was rye in name only, but it wasn't truly rye bread. Um, and again, I mean, can you imagine how lucky I was? In 1976, I'm learning drei Stufen Sauerteigführung, molded in 1976 of all things. So I was unbelievably fortunate, and rye has always been my favorite grain, I guess, and I've taught a lot. I think I've had a small impact on increasing the good rye in America because I've loved it so much, and um, I've taught it a lot to people. And I think when people eat a real rye bread, it just really hits them in a very, very, very powerful place.
Okay, wenn Roggen schon relativ etabliert ist, wie sieht es denn dann mit anderen Sorten aus, mit älteren Sorten wie Dinkel, Emmer oder Einkorn? Sind die in den USA verbreitet? Kennt die jemand oder sind das alles Dinge, die nur Insider kennen?
Yeah, those are very popular now. They're very, very popular now. Um, I personally have not used things like emmer and einkorn. Not that I'm opposed to them at all, but to me, really the only profession that's more essential than baking is farming. And, emmer and einkorn have about 10 or 20%, maybe 30% of the yield of wheat or rye.
Yeah.
And so what does that mean? That means, the farmer's going to spend the same amount of money for seed, probably more because they're rare grains, and he's going to spend the same amount of money for fuel for the tractor, and he's going to spend the same amount of time, but his yield is 30% of what it would be for wheat. So the only way he's going to be able to justify planting einkorn or emmer is by charging a lot more for it. And that means that the bakers who are using it, their breads are going to cost more. And I personally feel like good bread should be available for every single person. And if we have to charge an exorbitant amount of money because we're baking with a grain that is very low yielding, then we're basically telling a big segment of society, you can't have this bread because you don't have enough money. And I don't particularly like that approach. So it's not that I have any other opposition to emmer or einkorn. I like spelt very much. But that's a challenging grain for farmers too, because as you know, it's one of the covered wheats, and so it takes extra equipment to be able to husk it. So, yeah, and if I were blindfolded, my taste buds aren't that sensitive probably, because if I was blindfolded and somebody gave me, 6 loaves of bread and said, okay, 2 of these have spelt in them, pick them out, I'm not sure that I could pick them out.
Ja, wenn wir jetzt schon bei den alten Sorten sind, schließt sich ja im Grunde gleich im Kopf die Frage an, wie sieht es denn aus mit ökologischem Landbau, mit Biogetreide? Als ich in Vermont war, da hat sich mir doch zu meinem Erstaunen gezeigt, dass ganz viele Bauernhöfe dort Organic am Schild stehen hatten, also Biolandhöfe waren, Biobauernhöfe waren. Ist das typisch für die USA generell oder ist das eine Eigenart von Vermont und alle anderen ticken ein bisschen, ich sag mal jetzt im schlechteren Sinne, traditioneller, also konventioneller?
I think you can pretty much find them anywhere if you want, in most places. I don't know the current stats, but I know the percentage of grains that are grown that are organic is way less than 10%. Way less than 10%. So people who want it, I personally only want organic grains in my life, but there are a lot of people who can't afford to buy bread that's made with organic grains. And I was always kind of a bad businessman. All the years I owned a bakery, first of all, if anybody ever asked for free bread, there was a sign on the wall saying, just ask and you'll get free bread. But I also had this very kind of odd philosophy back then. I bought the cheapest flour I could, partially because I wasn't educated back then. This is 30 years ago or more. I wasn't very well educated about flour, so I bought the cheapest flour I could because I felt like that's going to enable me to keep the price of the bread as cheap as possible for people, as inexpensive as possible. And I would rather sell like 400 loaves of bread for €1 rather than 200 loaves of bread for €2. Both of them were going to give you €400, but I wanted to have bread in as many bellies as possible. So that was why I had the goal to sell it for as little as possible. And since I was making lots of cakes and chocolates and other things, I just felt like good. So the cake will subsidize the bread.
Kommen wir mal noch auf ein Thema zu sprechen, ein Trend, der sich im Moment unter den deutschen Hobbybäckern breit macht, eine Art Virus aus meiner Sicht, vor allem in den sozialen Netzwerken oder angeheizt durch die sozialen Netzwerke, wo die Bilder mit der wildesten, gröbsten Porung in Weizenbroten ausgetauscht werden. Das geht ja oft nur mit Hochproteinweizen, der im Anbau, zumindest hier in unserer Gegend, ökologisch fragwürdig ist, weil eben zum Beispiel mit sehr viel Stickstoff gedüngt werden muss, um so viel Protein in den Weizen zu bekommen. Wenn du wählen könntest, stünde dann eher die Gebäckqualität, also im Wesentlichen das optimale Volumen im Vordergrund, oder zuerst die Art und Weise des Getreideanbaus?
Well, a couple things, Lutz. I think, first of all, the climate of the U.S. probably is more conducive to higher protein wheats than the climate, certainly, of Germany and lots of Europe. Varietals are probably developed that are going to have higher protein. Those are true. I think it's super exciting when you make a ciabatta and it's all full of holes. I think that's a really fun sight to see.
Yeah, I like it too.
In America, now that we're in this kind of digital age, things kind of take on a life of their own. And so, you've got on Instagram, people put in pictures that are just, oh, you think you have a lot of holes in your bread? Look at my bread. And so it becomes almost this macho thing, or it's like, oh, you make this bread with 85% hydration. You should see mine. I do 90% hydration. So it becomes this sort of macho thing that I'm more of a man than you because I can put more water in the bread. Well, up to a point, if it's better to have a little extra water because the flour can express itself a little better compared to a dry dough and all that stuff. But water for water's sake doesn't make any sense. Holes for holes' sake doesn't make any sense. So there, a lot of kind of Instagram type bakers, they really have taken this to places where it doesn't necessarily need to be.
So leid es mir tut, wir haben jetzt schon über eine Stunde lang miteinander gesprochen. Wir müssen zum Ende kommen und eine Frage möchte ich nicht lassen. Wir werden jetzt nicht auf dein langes Bäckerleben zurückblicken, sondern in die Zukunft. Du bist ja noch ein junger Mann und da gibt es sicherlich noch einige Projekte. Bei King Arthur bist du ja meines Wissens nicht mehr so aktiv, hast dich ein bisschen rausgezogen, aber was möchtest du noch lernen oder leben oder was sind deine nächsten Pläne, wenn du an Teig denkst?
When I left King Arthur, I continued to teach the professional classes because there wasn't anybody who was capable of taking on those classes. So I was teaching about 6 weeks a year, usually spread out by a month or so, maybe more than 6. I can't remember now. And I had teaching engagements at a wonderful place. The French Pastry School in Chicago is a great school, and this and that kind of thing. Well, just as it is for everybody, I mean, my life is now completely changed. So there hasn't been really anything going on this year since the virus hit. So I don't know what's in the future. I have taught 6 classes over the last couple of years in Russia, and that's been a very profound experience for me. and I was scheduled to go back in September. Well, that won't happen, and we'll see if I have the opportunity. I'll go back, and we're talking about next year sometime if things calm down. I love teaching. I love engaging people. I love it when I feel like I'm helping people grow as bakers. So I hope my teaching days aren't done. My learning days certainly aren't done. I've been learning a lot from a lot of different people over the last few years, which is a great feeling, of course. So I hope I have the opportunity to teach more and learn more and share more. Those are my goals.
Das klingt großartig und ich hoffe dann mal ganz uneigennützig, dass wir uns auch einmal wirklich persönlich sehen. Wir haben uns ja letztes Jahr um eine Woche verpasst, leider. Und dass ich was von dir lernen kann.
And you will teach me too, Lutz. I'm sure there's an amazing amount that I could learn from you.
Das sollten wir drauf ankommen lassen, Jeffrey. Wenn Corona uns wieder reißen lässt, vielleicht im nächsten Jahr. Hab ganz vielen Dank, Jeffrey, für die Zeit, die du uns hier, also meinen Lesern und mir, geschenkt hast.
It's a pleasure. It's a real pleasure, Lutz. Thank you.
Mach's gut, auf bald, Jeffrey. Tschüss.
Keep well, okay?
Yeah.
Thank you.
You too.
Thank you.
Bye bye.
Bye.
Die nächste Folge von Plötzlich, Bäcker, dem Brot-Podcast, gibt es ganz bestimmt. Wenn du bis dahin meine Arbeit am Blog oder für diesen Podcast unterstützen möchtest, dann klicke dich auf plötzblog.de/unterstützen. Vielen Dank.